cold winds, open waters, and the long memory of the North. On a grey morning in the year 793, the horizon shifted. A long, low shape crept out of the sea mist, carved of oak, wide of beam, silent but for the rhythm of oars and the hush of wind. It glided toward the Northumbrian shore, toward a small island known only for prayer and tide and gulls. The monks at Lindisfarne would not yet know what it meant, only that the sky had grown darker and that strangers had come bearing axes. And in that moment, quiet, brutal, fast, the world changed. But this story doesn't begin in violence. It begins long before the raids, before the longships, before the monasteries burned and the word Viking echoed down the halls of kings. It begins in the north, in a land of cold fjords and grey stone, of long winters and endless summer light, of farmers and fishermen, of gods whispered to in the darkness and ancestors remembered in stone. It begins in the silence between snowflakes, in the crackle of firewood under wool-wrapped feet, in the soft creak of timber as a longhouse settles in for the night. This is the world before the Vikings, and the world the Vikings carried with them, across waves and ages. Tonight, or this morning, or whenever your thoughts are quiet enough to drift, we'll travel slowly through this world together. A world shaped by water and wind, by cold soil and long memory. A world that rose not in the glory of one moment, but in the rhythm of centuries. There's no need to stay awake, but if you do, you'll drift gently through more than 1,000 years of Scandinavian history, from forgotten stone circles to royal crowns, from wooden ships to steam-powered ones, from wandering chieftains to the rise of kingdoms, and through it all, the pulse of a people who built quietly, sailed boldly, and remembered deeply. So take a slow breath, settle in. Let's go north, not through storm or conquest, but through the steady echo of time. Long before anyone called them Vikings, the people of the far north lived simply. They were not kings, not yet. They were farmers, herdsmen, hunters, families that lived in narrow valleys carved by ice, beneath skies that stretched endlessly in every direction. In Norway, steep cliffs framed deep fjords, dark ribbons of water winding inland from the sea. Small farms clung to the slopes like moss to stone. People grew what they could, barley, oats, rye, and raised animals hardy enough to survive the bitter months. In Sweden, the landscape flattened. Lakes spread out like glass. Pines stood tall and still. The people here hunted elk and bear, traded fur and amber, and watched the skies for signs of spring. In Denmark, the land rolled gently, not soft, but less harsh. The sea was never far, and with it came fish, storms, and stories. The houses were long, low, and built from timber and turf. Smoke drifted upward from hearth fires that rarely went out. Inside, families lived together in tight, warm spaces. Children played with carved wooden animals. Elders hummed songs older than speech. They were not isolated. Even before the Viking Age, trade reached these shores. Amber from the Baltic, iron from inland, silver from the south. They knew the world, and the world knew of them faintly. But something was changing. By the late 700s, the balance of Europe had begun to shift. To the south, the Frankish Empire rose under Charlemagne. Christianity was spreading, bringing new ideas and new targets. Across the North Sea, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms built monasteries filled with gold, manuscripts, and wealth protected only by prayer. And in the north, the people watched. Boats improved, sails grew larger, tools sharper. A generation of craftsmen, farmers, and warriors raised sons who were no longer content to farm the same fields. They looked outward, not with evil in their hearts, but with hunger, curiosity, restlessness. The seas they had fished for centuries could now carry them further, to new lands, to new goods, to stories waiting to be written in salt and blood and smoke. The raiding began not with conquest, but with testing. A monastery here, a coastal village there. The boats arrived, struck quickly, and vanished. At first, it was seen as piracy, as an irritation. But the pattern continued, and slowly the world began to understand. To call them only raiders is to forget their world. Yes, they took, but they also traded, settled, built, ruled. They founded cities like Dublin and York. They served as guards in foreign courts. They travelled to the edges of the known world, to Constantinople, to Baghdad, even to North America. And still they remembered home. Things rose in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Even as Christianity replaced the old gods, the memory of the longhouse, the oar, the fjord remained. This is the thread we'll follow. From the first farmers to the last kings of the north, from burial mounds to coronation halls, from the breath of the gods to the signing of treaties. We'll move slowly, not through battle cries, but through snowfalls, through the hush of forest, through the creak of wood and the glint of iron, through the silence after the last saga is told. So if you find your eyes growing heavy, that's all right. You're safe here. The journey will carry on. And when you return, whenever you return, the North will still be waiting. Before the word Viking existed, there were no kings in Scandinavia, no cities, no sagas written in ink. There were only people, living in the cold and the quiet, beneath wide skies and deeper forests. They settled along rocky coastlines and beside still lakes that turned to glass in summer and ice in winter. Their homes were long and low, built from timber and turf. Smoke drifted from the central hearth. The walls creaked softly in the wind. Inside, families ate together, worked together, and listened to stories passed down in silence and firelight. This was Northern Europe before the Viking Age, a world still waiting to be named. By the year 500, the Roman Empire had collapsed in the west. Christianity had spread into the old provinces of Gaul, Iberia, and Britannia. Cities rose and fell in stone. Kingdoms began to take shape. But beyond the Danevirke, a great earthen wall that separated modern-day Denmark from the lands of the Franks, life moved more slowly. There were no cities in Scandinavia, no written histories, but there was life, and it was full. Early Scandinavian society was made up of small tribal groups, extended families bound by loyalty and shared memory. These clans gathered around local chieftains, whose power rested on reputation more than law. A good leader was generous with food and fair with judgment. A poor one might be quietly replaced. There was no single ruler, no united state, but there was order, a kind of rhythm shaped by custom and soil and season. Evidence from archaeology reveals timber halls, large, rectangular buildings used for gathering, feasting, and resolving disputes. These were more than homes. They were centers of decision-making, symbols of status, and the beating heart of the community. Nearby, smaller houses clustered around fields and pastures. The farms were small, but functional. People grew barley and oats. They raised cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats. They hunted in the forests, fished in rivers and coastal waters, and gathered berries and herbs when the weather allowed. Death was not an ending, but a passage. Across Scandinavia, burial mounds still rise gently from the earth, grassy humps that once marked the graves of the important people. Within them, archaeologists have found remains laid to rest with tools, weapons, jewelry, and offerings. Some were buried in boats, placed on land and covered with soil. Not yet the sleek longships of later centuries, but small, rounded vessels that still pointed toward other worlds. These graves suggest a belief in continuity after death, a world where the dead needed provisions, protection, and perhaps passage. Despite their remote geography, the people of Scandinavia were not isolated. Trade routes crisscrossed the Baltic Sea, connecting them to the wider world. They traded amber, furs, hides, and iron for glass beads, bronze ornaments, and finely woven cloth from the south. Roman coins have been found buried in the soil of Denmark. Even after Rome's fall, merchants continued to pass through, and stories passed with them. Stories of far cities, strange customs, and sacred kings. The language of the North during this time was Proto-Norse, a distant ancestor of modern Scandinavian tongues. It was spoken, sung, and remembered. Runes, simple, angular symbols, were carved into stone and wood, often to mark names or leave blessings. There were no books, but there were poems. Memory lived in the mouths of skalds, poets and storytellers who preserved the names of ancestors and the deeds of the gods. Though written Norse mythology would come later, its roots were already deep. Odin, Thor, and Freya had long been known. So had the 9 worlds, the sacred tree, the final battle. Religion was intimate and bound to the land. There were no temples. The sacred was found in groves, rivers, hills, and hearths. Offerings were made at water's edge. Weapons, gold, even human remains preserved in peat bogs. These acts were not theatrical. They were quiet, instinctive, communal. Life was harsh. The gods were close. People held festivals tied to the seasons, to the sowing of grain, the birth of livestock, the tilt of the sun. The blot, a ritual sacrifice, usually of animals, was central. It reinforced bonds not only between people and their gods, but between each other. It gave shape to time and meaning to labor. Tools and technology improved slowly but steadily. By the 6th and 7th centuries, ironworking had become more widespread. Axes grew sharper, plows more efficient. Boats were built with greater care. Some were already fitted with sails, broad, square cloths of wool that caught the wind and allowed for greater distances. These early ships were not yet longships, but they hinted at what was to come. In the south, circular ring forts appeared, defensive structures that suggest growing social tensions and a need to protect wealth and people from outsiders. By the early 700s, Europe had entered a new phase of transformation. To the south, Charlemagne's empire expanded. Christianity was no longer a fringe religion. It was backed by armies, and missionaries followed in their wake. In the British Isles, monasteries multiplied, often wealthy, isolated, and poorly defended. And all along the coastlines of the North Sea and the Baltic, change was stirring. In Scandinavia, boats improved, communities grew, ambition quietly awakened in the sons of farmers and fishermen. They had heard stories of southern riches, gold chalices, jeweled books, silver crosses. They had the tools, they had the tide, and now they had the will. And so, as the 8th century drew to a close, a single boat set sail from a northern shore. Its oars cut the sea in silence, its sails filled, and beneath the grey sky, it carried not just warriors, but the beginning of an age. Before the world knew what a Viking was, the sea already knew their names. For generations, the people of Scandinavia had lived along the water. Their coasts were not barriers, they were highways. Fjords reached deep into the mountains. Rivers threaded through forests. Lakes opened to the sky. From an early age, Norse children learned the feel of the oar and the rhythm of the wave. And by the middle of the 8th century, their ships had begun to change. The earliest sea-going vessels were simple. Broad, sturdy boats meant for fishing or short journeys along the coast. But by 750, something new had begun to appear in the shipyards of Norway and Denmark. Longer hulls, overlapping planks, keels deep enough to hold steady in rough water, yet shallow enough to land on an open beach. These boats were made not just for floating, but for going fast, landing quickly, and vanishing before anyone could respond. They were not yet called longships, but the idea had taken root. At the same time, communities across Scandinavia were shifting. Tribal chieftains saw greater wealth to maintain their influence. Kin groups became more competitive. The old structures of loyalty began to stretch. Young men with no land and little inheritance saw opportunity not in the field, but in the sea. Stories travelled faster than caravans. Stories of soft churches in the west, of gold hanging from altar rails, of silver cups used for wine instead of trade. In a world where prestige mattered, these tales sparked imagination. And soon, ambition. The first coastal raids began quietly. A village attacked in Frisia. A few merchant ships taken in the Baltic. These early raids may not have been very different from piracy. Sudden, opportunistic, and small in scale. But they served as practice. Crews learned where the defences were weak, how quickly they could move, how far they could go and still return before the wind turned. In time, these raids would become more organised. But for now, they were experiments. Vast, brutal flashes that appeared and vanished like sea spray. One of the most important patterns in this early phase was the choice of targets. The raiders struck places that were wealthy but undefended. Monasteries, coastal towns, isolated estates. Their aim was not conquest, but plunder. They sought silver, cloth, livestock and people. Enslaved captives who could be sold in markets farther south. Some attacks were likely planned in advance. Others happened by chance. But all followed a similar rhythm. Arrive quickly, move faster than the alarm, and leave before a response could be mustered. By the early 780s, reports of strange ships had reached the courts of Anglo-Saxon England and the Carolingian Empire. The sources are sparse but nervous. A few mentions of heathens from the north or sea wolves causing trouble along the coasts. No one yet called them Vikings. That word would come later. For now, they were just a problem, one among many. Few rulers considered them a threat. That would change. On the morning of June 8th, 793, a ship approached the holy island of Lindisfarne, just off the northeast coast of England. The monastery there had stood for over a century. It was a centre of Christian learning, known for its illuminated manuscripts, its relics, its quiet isolation. The monks had no army, no walls, no warning. The raiders came ashore with axes and swords. They looted the church, killed or captured the monks, and left with what they could carry. When the news spread, it shocked all of Christendom. This was not just another raid. Lindisfarne was sacred. Its sacking was seen not merely as an attack on property, but on faith itself. Alcuin of York, a scholar and advisor to Charlemagne, wrote in horror that pagans had defiled the house of God. The idea of the North began to change in the minds of those who heard the story. These were not just thieves, they were enemies of God. The shape of the Viking Age, though still forming, was beginning to cast its shadow. Yet even now, it would be a mistake to view this moment as a sudden eruption. The raid on Lindisfarne was not the beginning of the Viking Age, but its loudest early signal. It marked a shift from scattered piracy to something more sustained, more intentional. Across the coasts of Ireland, Scotland and Francia, similar raids followed in the years after. Monasteries were attacked, towns burned, silver flowed northward, and still the ships kept coming. What drove this expansion remains the subject of debate. Some scholars suggest population growth in Scandinavia outpaced the available farmland. Others point to internal power struggles, chieftains needing wealth to maintain loyalty. Still others argue it was simply opportunity. The collapse of central Roman authority had left many coastal regions rich but exposed, and the Norse had ships capable of reaching them before anyone could respond. It was also, perhaps, something deeper, a cultural momentum. The people of the North had long lived with hardship, isolation, and the need to adapt. Their world rewarded daring, their gods favored boldness, and their traditions celebrated the journey, not just for war, but for experience. A man's honor was built not by staying home, but by facing danger, crossing water, and returning with stories and spoils. By 793, the message was clear. The raiders had come. They would not stay, not yet, but they would return again and again, year after year, with better ships, larger crews, sharper aims, and in time, they would not only raid, they would settle, rule, and shape the map of Europe. But for now, the coast still burned quietly, and the wind carried with it a name the monks at Lindisfarne would never forget. The tide carried silence that morning. The sea, for all its power, moved softly, lapping at the worn stones of Lindisfarne's shore. It was a place of peace, a holy island just off the northeastern coast of England. Monks rose early here, as they always had. They sang prayers in rhythm with the rising sun. Their hands copied scripture by the flicker of oil lamps. Their lives moved quietly, bound to a calendar of devotion. They had no reason to fear the ocean, not yet. The monastery had stood for over 100 years. Founded in the 600s, it was part of the flowering of Christianity that had taken root in Northumbria. It was remote, far from politics, far from war. The monks lived simply, but not without beauty. Their community produced the famed Lindisfarne Gospels, a book filled with intricate patterns, vivid colours, and delicate script. It was a place where art and spirit met, a sanctuary. But on June 8th, 793, something came from the sea that no prayer could turn away. The ships appeared as shadows at first, long and narrow, barely cresting the horizon. Their sails were square, and their hulls low in the water. As they drew closer, oars dipped in unison, sending ripples across the shallows. The monks would have seen them from the shore. Unfamiliar shapes, moving with purpose. Perhaps they assumed they were traders, or perhaps they didn't know what to think at all. The raiders made landfall quickly. They came with axes, swords, and little hesitation. They stormed the church, overturned altars, shattered relics, and spill blood in a place that had known only peace. Some monks were killed, others were taken, bound and marched to ships where they would be sold as slaves far from home. Gold was stolen, silver too. But it was not just treasure that was taken. It was the illusion that the north was far away, that the world of the Vikings could not touch the sacred. The news spread with speed and disbelief. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded it with alarm. The ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. Across Europe, the reaction was one of shock, not merely at the violence, but at its direction. A holy site had been defiled, and it had come from the sea, from the land of the pagans, the wilderness beyond the Christian world. Alcuin of York, a scholar and advisor to Charlemagne, wrote of the attack in letters tinged with horror and confusion. He wondered how such evil could strike a place so sacred. He asked whether this was punishment for sin, a sign of divine displeasure. For many in the Christian world, the idea of pagan warriors attacking a monastery was not just a political event, it was a spiritual crisis. And yet, for the raiders themselves, it was not evil, it was opportunity. They did not come out of hatred for Christ or his followers. They came because the monastery was wealthy, exposed and undefended. To them, it was not a church, it was a storehouse. It was also a test, and the test had gone well. They had landed, taken what they wanted, and sailed away again without resistance. That success would not go unnoticed back home. The raid on Lindisfarne was not the first Viking attack, but it was the first that Europe could not ignore. It marked the beginning of a pattern that would soon spread like ripples from a thrown stone. In the years that followed, other monasteries were targeted. Iona, in the Hebrides, was raided in 795 and again in 802 and 806. In the second attack, 68 monks were killed. The survivors fled to the Irish mainland, carrying with them what books and relics they could. Even the most sacred sites were no longer safe. The Vikings, as they would come to be called, showed a deep understanding of where to strike and when. Monasteries were ideal targets, rich in silver, grain, livestock, and manuscripts. More importantly, they were often far from military centers. The church's moral power did not extend to armed defense. The monks could offer prayers, but they could not raise shields. But the raids were not random. They followed currents, wind, and the slow rhythm of sailing seasons. Most Viking raids occurred in the late spring and summer months, when the seas were calmer and the days longer. The crews sailed in boats called carvi, smaller than the later great longships, but fast and maneuverable. These ships could travel quickly across open sea or up rivers. They could land on beaches, slip through estuaries, and disappear into the fog. This flexibility made the early Vikings more dangerous than their numbers alone would suggest. Though Lindisfarne was the loudest alarm, other coastal communities felt the sting soon after. In Ireland, Viking ships were spotted along the eastern shore. In 795, they attacked Lambay Island near Dublin. In 798, they struck again, killing the abbot of Rathlin. These early raids were often brief, violent, and followed no clear pattern. But over time, the attackers learned where the wealth flowed and how to reach it. There was a cycle to these incursions. The Vikings would come, take what they could, and leave. Months later, they would return, sometimes to the same place, sometimes elsewhere along the coast. In the early years, they did not try to hold territory. They were not yet settlers. They were raiders, operating from home bases in Norway, Denmark, or perhaps Shetland and the Orkney Islands, which they may have used as seasonal anchor points. What made the Vikings so difficult to stop was their unpredictability. Unlike armies that moved overland and required roads, supply lines and coordination, Viking crews could appear almost anywhere the water touched. A quiet fishing village in Ireland, a monastery on the French coast, a port town in the Low Countries. No coast was too far, and no river too narrow. They did not need permission, only wind and time. In the Christian world, the term heathen became synonymous with fear. But in the north, these early successes did not lead to reflection. They led to celebration. Warriors returned with silver, stories, and proof of their strength. Raiding became a path to prestige. It was not seen as dishonorable. It was seen as clever. Successful leaders could attract more followers. Young men who had little hope of inheriting land at home now had a new way to make their fortunes. As raids continued, new networks formed. Captured goods were not hoarded, they were traded. Viking silver made its way into markets as far away as the Abbasid Caliphate. Slaves were sold in Scandinavia, Frisia, and the Islamic world. The North, once seen as a fringe, had become a player in global exchange. But not every raid was easy. As the attacks continued, resistance began to grow. Coastal communities learned to build lookouts. Monasteries began to construct walls. Local rulers organized militias. Some Vikings were caught and killed. Others adapted. What began as violence shifted slowly towards something more complex: negotiation, tribute, and in time, settlement. By 820, the shock of Lindisfarne had worn into a kind of weary awareness. The Vikings were no longer a surprise. They were a presence, unwelcome, unpredictable, but understood. The Christian world had begun to adapt, but so had the Vikings. What they learned in these years about boats, tides, markets, and men would lay the foundation for something larger, because the age of the quick raid was ending, and a new phase was about to begin. By the early 800s, the tides no longer brought only raiders. They carried with them something slower, more lasting, and far more complex. What had begun as a wave of coastal strikes, swift and violent, now began to evolve. The ships still came, but they did not always leave. The raiders began to stay. It happened gradually. A few men wintering over, a boat repaired and left behind, a camp that became a market, and somewhere along the wet edge of a foreign shore, a settlement was born. This was not conquest, not yet. It was curiosity and calculation. The men who stepped off Viking ships in this era were still warriors, yes, but they were also traders, craftsmen, and opportunists. They studied the places they raided. They learned the rhythms of tide and tribute, and increasingly they decided it was worth more to remain than to flee. The Viking Age had entered its next phase, one of expansion and settlement, a time when Norse power would move inland, up rivers, across islands, and into the fabric of Europe itself. In Ireland, the transformation was already visible. Raiding had begun in the late 700s and 90s, focused mostly on isolated monasteries. But by the 820s, Viking ships were making annual appearances along the east coast. They struck Armagh in 821, Cork and Lismore soon after. Then, in 837, a force of 60 ships sailed up the River Boyne. Not just raiding, but engaging Irish armies in open battle. They had come not only to plunder, but to test the land and its people, and they stayed. By 841, the Vikings had established a longfort, a fortified ship harbour, on the River Liffey. This was the beginning of Dublin, not the city as we know it now, but a timber camp of Norse men, fighters, traders, shipbuilders. They wintered there. They repaired boats. They traded slaves, cloth and silver. And in time, the camp grew. It gained buildings, paths, a market square. By the middle of the century, Dublin had become the centre of Norse power in Ireland, a hybrid town, both feared and relied upon. Similar patterns emerged across the British Isles. In Scotland, Viking forces pushed into the Hebrides and the Orkney Islands. These islands, scattered like stepping stones across the North Atlantic, were ideal for seasonal base camps and future colonies. The Orkneys in particular became a Norse stronghold, later ruled by earls who owed allegiance to the kings of Norway. Even the Isle of Man, small and forested, became a Viking enclave, a place where Norse culture blended with Celtic roots. In England, the shift was slower, but no less significant. The early raids had hit hard along the eastern coasts, especially in Northumbria and East Anglia. But during the 830s and 840s, Viking activity grew bolder. They began to move up rivers, the Thames, the Humber, the Severn. Their ships, built with shallow keels, could glide far inland. No city was safe if it lay near a riverbank. The longship made this possible. It was a marvel of design, fast, flexible, and reliable. Crafted from oak, its overlapping planks were held together with iron rivets and sealed with tar made from pine resin. The hull was long and narrow, allowing it to ride high on the water. A square sail of wool, dyed red or striped with bold patterns, gave it power in open water. And when the wind failed, the crew turned to their oars, up to 30 men, rowing in silence, eyes on the shore. The longship could travel across the open sea, but also sail up a shallow river or beach directly onto a shore. It did not require a harbour. It left no warning. And when it was time to leave, it was gone as swiftly as it came. Norse seafarers did not use compasses. They relied on memory, sunstones, and the feel of the wind. They watched the flight of birds, the colour of the water, the taste of the air. Some scholars believe they used crude maps made of carved sticks and shells, passed down from father to son. But more often, they used instinct, story, and shared knowledge. A sailor who lived long enough carried the coastlines in his head. With such tools, they expanded further still. Along the coast of Francia, modern-day France, Viking raiders became a regular presence by the 830s. They attacked Rouen in 841, then moved up the Seine to strike Paris in 845. That attack, led by a chieftain named Ragnar, perhaps the same one later sung of in legend, resulted in a ransom paid by Charles the Bald, king of West Francia. The Vikings did not take the city. They simply left, wealthier than before. This was a pattern repeated often in these years. Instead of conquering outright, Viking leaders learned to extract tribute. The Franks called it Danegeld, the Danes' gold. It was protection money, paid by rulers who lacked the means to defend every village, every monastery, every bend in the river. For the Norse, it was good business, but settlement was never far behind. Along the Loire River, Viking camps appeared near Nantes and Tours. Some grew into seasonal markets. Others became full towns, like the one that formed at Noirmoutier. These were not just military bases, they were homes, however rough. And with them came families, trade networks, and new kinds of relationships with the local people. The Vikings were not only warriors, they were traders too. They brought with them furs, walrus ivory, soapstone, and iron goods from the north. In return, they took silver, wine, silk, and spices. Their trade networks reached deep, from the Abbasid Caliphate in the east to the monasteries of Ireland in the west. Arab coins have been found in Norwegian graves. Irish brooches turned up in Swedish burial mounds. Silk from Constantinople made its way to Denmark. The Norse were connectors, people of the water who moved between worlds. Where they settled, they adapted. In Ireland, some Viking towns adopted local customs and even intermarried with Gaelic families. In parts of England, Norse settlers farmed alongside Saxon neighbours using tools and techniques that were not so different. They built homes of timber and turf. They raised sheep and pigs. They brewed ale, spun wool, and held markets. These were not just warriors. They were men and women building a life far from where they had been born. Not all settlements were peaceful. In many places, Norse power came at the point of a blade. But in this era, the decades between 820 and 870, something new was unfolding. The lines between raider and resident began to blur. Norse law came with them, a system based on honor, reputation, and public assembly. Disputes were settled at the Thing, a gathering where free men debated, judged, and resolved. In time, local things were established in places like Dublin and York. These assemblies helped form the foundation of local governance and would echo through Scandinavian legal traditions for centuries to come. Religion, too, became more fluid. The Norse still worshipped their gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, but they encountered Christianity often. Some adopted it, either out of conviction or convenience. Converts gained easier access to local alliances. Others remained loyal to the old ways. But even among pagans, there was curiosity. Churches were no longer just places to plunder. They became part of the landscape, part of the negotiation. By the end of this period, the Norse presence in Europe was no longer a matter of raids. It was a fact of life. Viking towns dotted the coastlines of Ireland, England, and northern Francia. Norse families settled farmland, built fences, and buried their dead in foreign soil. Children were born who would never see Norway, never hear the gulls cry over the fjords of home. But they carried the memory, in names, in speech, in the shape of the longship carved into their father's grave. The age of expansion was not yet over. Larger armies would soon come. Kingdoms would rise in Denmark and Norway. Treaties would be signed. Cities would fall. But this period, the years between 820 and 870, marked a turning point. The Vikings were no longer just visitors. They were part of the story now. Settlers, traders, rivals, neighbors. The sea was still their lifeline, but their eyes were on the land. And with each passing year, the map of Europe shifted. Not with a bang, but with the steady creak of oars, the hammering of tent stakes, and the soft cry of a child born on a riverbank far from home. By the year 870, the Norse were no longer strangers to the coast of Europe. They had landed, raided, traded, and settled. They had built camps that became towns, and towns that began to feel like home. But what came next was something different. No longer content with seasonal forays, the Vikings began to move with purpose, with strategy, with scale. They arrived not as scattered raiding crews. but as a unified force. It was the dawn of something larger, something new. In Anglo-Saxon England, the land was divided into 4 kingdoms: Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the centre, East Anglia in the east, and Wessex in the south. Each had its own kings, armies, rivalries, and ambitions. There was no single monarch to unite them all, no great wall to repel invaders. Though some had resisted earlier Viking raids, the kingdoms were not prepared for what came next. It began in 865, when a massive Viking force landed in East Anglia. Later chroniclers would call it the Great Heathen Army, a coalition of warriors from Denmark and possibly Norway, larger than any that had come before. It was not a raiding party. It was a mobile invasion force. Estimates of its size vary, but it likely included several thousand men, enough to not just pillage, but conquer. The army was led by several brothers, legendary in Norse lore: Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba, said to be sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, the mythic raider of Paris and Lindisfarne. Whether the details of their ancestry are true is unclear, but the threat they posed was real. They came not for silver, but for land, not to raid, but to rule. East Anglia fell quickly. Its king, Edmund, was captured and later killed, martyred, according to Christian tradition, for refusing to renounce his faith. He would become Saint Edmund, and his cult would spread. But in 865, his kingdom became a Viking base. The army overwintered there, fed and sheltered by the land they had taken. From East Anglia, the Vikings marched north. In 867, they captured York, one of the most important cities in Northumbria. The Northumbrians tried to retake it, but their attack failed. 2 rival kings, Alla and Osbert, were killed, and Norse rule in York began. The city would remain under Viking control for most of the next century. They renamed it Jorvik, and from there they governed. York was not merely a military prize. It was a thriving commercial centre, a place where wool, leather, silver and grain passed through crowded markets and along muddy lanes. The Norse settled in and took over its systems of trade. They minted coins, governed with a local thing, and brought craftsmen from across the sea. Excavations of Viking York reveal rich cultural layers: metalwork, glass beads, amber, ship nails, and bone tools. Life continued, but under new banners. By the late 860s, the Viking army moved again. It struck Mercia, advancing deep into the heart of England. The Mercian king, Burgred, fled to Rome. His lands were divided. Part of Mercia remained independent, but the rest fell under Norse influence. The boundaries of England were beginning to change, carved not by treaties, but by axes and campfires. But the Vikings had not yet conquered Wessex. Wessex, the southernmost of the English kingdoms, was ruled by King Ethelred, and after his death in 871, by his younger brother, Alfred. A cautious, studious man, Alfred was not known for battlefield glory, but he would become the most important figure of his age. For while the Norse swept across England, Alfred would hold a line. In 871, a new Viking army, sometimes called the Great Summer Army, joined the invasion, and Wessex faced wave after wave of attack. There were defeats. Alfred was driven into hiding in the marshes of Somerset, where, according to legend, he once burned bread while lost in thought. But the legend masks something deeper. He waited and planned. In 878, at the Battle of Edington, Alfred rallied his forces and defeated the Viking leader Guthrum. It was a turning point. Rather than continue the war, Alfred offered terms. Guthrum agreed to a treaty, the Treaty of Wedmore, in which he converted to Christianity and withdrew his forces. In exchange, he would rule the lands the Vikings already held. These lands, in the east and north of England, would come to be known as the Danelaw, regions under Norse control, governed by Norse laws and populated by Norse settlers. The Danelaw included parts of Northumbria, East Anglia, and eastern Mercia. It was not a single kingdom, but a patchwork of territories united by culture, language, and custom. Here, the Norse shaped life for decades. The term Danelaw refers to the use of Danish, that is Norse, legal customs, as opposed to Anglo-Saxon ones. The law was public and participatory. Disputes were settled at the Thing, the assembly where free men gathered to discuss matters of justice, land, and honour. Crimes were resolved through compensation rather than imprisonment. A murder could be answered with a fine if the families agreed. Theft carried heavy penalties. Reputation was everything. Daily life in the Danelaw was often not so different from elsewhere. Farmers raised crops and animals. Markets bustled. Churches continued to function, though under Norse oversight. In many places, coexistence developed. Anglo-Saxon communities adapted to Norse rulers, and over time, the lines between the two peoples blurred. Intermarriage was common. So was bilingualism. Norse words entered the English language: sky, egg, law, knife. Even the suffix by in town names like Derby or Grimsby comes from the Old Norse word for village. In York, Viking kings ruled over a diverse population. Some were Christian, others pagan. Artisans produced brooches and belt fittings with Scandinavian motifs. Coins were struck bearing Norse names. Archaeological finds show homes built with wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs. Beneath the city, layers of compacted mud preserve everything from leather shoes to wooden bowls. A frozen image of a bustling town under Norse control. Not all was peaceful. There were rebellions, friction between rulers, periodic raids even from Norse neighbours. But the era of constant burning and looting had begun to shift. Where the Vikings stayed, they built not only walls, but identities. Leadership also changed. In Dublin, York, and East Anglia, Norse kings emerged, men with names like Guthfrith, Ragnall, and Sihtric. Some were born abroad, but many were native-born. Children of Norse fathers and local mothers, raised in towns that straddled two worlds. These kings held power not through brute force alone, but through diplomacy, trade, and alliances. The Viking kingdom of York even maintained relations with the kings of Wessex and the Gaelic lords of Ireland. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, the idea of kingship was taking root. Denmark saw the rise of King Harald Klak and later Horik I, rulers who began to centralize power and connect the scattered jarldoms of the Danish peninsula. In Norway, petty kings competed for dominance, a struggle that would culminate in the rise of Harald Fairhair, who claimed to unify the land after the Battle of Hafrsfjord in the late 9th century. Whether he truly ruled all of Norway is uncertain, but the myth of unity had begun. As kings emerged in the north, their attention turned outward. The settlements in England, Ireland, and the North Atlantic became extensions of their influence. Tribute flowed back across the sea. Ships carried messages, gifts, and orders. The Viking world was no longer a patchwork of independent raiders. It was a network tied together by trade, language, and now by kings. By the end of the 9th century, the map of England had changed. Wessex remained independent, a stronghold of Anglo-Saxon resistance, but much of the rest, the Danelaw, bore the marks of Norse rule. The scars of war had healed into new borders, and the people within them lived lives shaped by the rhythm of both plough and sail. The Vikings had come as outsiders, as enemies, but they remained as neighbours, rulers and kin. And though their god still rode in story, and their ship still rocked in the harbour, they now dreamed of something different, not just glory, but permanence, a place to stay, a name to leave behind. To live in the Viking world was to walk with gods, not distant deities in unreachable heavens, but figures close at hand. Their breath moved in the wind across fjords. Their judgment echoed in thunder and war cries. Their stories were told in the quiet of winter, by firelight, where old voices shaped the world from memory and myth. The Norse did not separate the sacred from the ordinary. The sacred was everywhere, in stone, in sea, in the long shadow of fate. They imagined the universe as a great tree, Yggdrasil, the world tree. Its roots wound through 9 realms, each a world of its own. In the branches lived the gods. In the roots stirred ancient forces. The gods were not all-powerful. They did not create the world from nothing. They inherited it, shaped it, and one day they too would fall. At the center of these beliefs was Odin, the All-Father, a wanderer in a wide-brimmed hat, often cloaked, sometimes missing an eye. He was not a gentle god. He sought wisdom at any cost. He sacrificed himself to himself, hanging 9 nights on Yggdrasil to learn the secrets of the runes, letters that could carve reality. He traded his eye for a drink from Mimir's well, a source of deep knowledge. Odin knew that Ragnarok, the end of the gods, would come. Still, he gathered heroes to his hall, preparing for a war he could not win. Odin's son, Thor, was beloved. God of thunder and protector of Midgard, the human world, Thor wielded Mjolnir, his great hammer, and rode in a chariot drawn by goats. He was strength, plain and raw. He did not scheme. He acted. His role was to keep the forces of chaos at bay. Giants, trolls, serpents. When storms rolled across the North Sea, many imagined Thor battling above the clouds. Freya, the goddess of love and battle, moved between beauty and blood. She wept tears of gold for her lost husband. She rode a chariot drawn by cats and claimed half the slain from every battlefield, bringing them not to Valhalla, but to her own hall, Folkvangr. Freya was also a practitioner of Seder, a type of magic rooted in fate and transformation. It was said that Odin learned this from her, though it was considered unmanly, mysterious, dangerous. Then there was Loki, a trickster, shapeshifter, and boundary breaker. He was neither good nor evil. He helped the gods and betrayed them in equal measure. He fathered monsters, the wolf Fenrir, the serpent Jörmungandr, and Hel, the cold queen of the underworld. He was laughter and madness. He reminded the Norse that even the cleverest plans could fall apart, and that chaos too had its place. These gods lived in Asgard, one of the 9 worlds, connected to the human realm by Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge. But the Norse world was not heaven and hell. It was a web of relationships between gods, giants, humans, elves and dwarves, between fate and freedom, between the known and the unknowable. The afterlife too was varied. Dying in battle could bring one to Valhalla, Odin's great hall, where warriors trained for the final war. But not all who died in combat went there. half were taken by Freya. Those who died of sickness or age might go to Helheim, ruled by the goddess Hel. It was not a place of torment, but of stillness, of memory. Others might rest in burial mounds where they lingered near their descendants, watching quietly as time passed them by. The Norse did not build temples in the way Christians or Romans did. Their worship took place in the open, in groves, near stones, by waterfalls. Certain places were believed to be Ve, or sacred spaces. There people performed blots, sacrificial offerings to the gods. These could be animals, food, or even weapons. Blood was spilled not out of cruelty, but as part of a cosmic bargain. We give, and the gods give back. The cycle continued. These rituals were community events. They brought villages together. Offerings were made not only to Odin and Thor, but to land spirits, ancestors, and local deities. A good harvest, a safe voyage, a healthy child. All could be aided by the right words, the right gift, the right season. These were not superstitions. They were a part of living well. In homes, small wooden carvings might represent favorite gods. People swore oaths on sacred rings. Runes were carved not only as writing, but as spells. A single symbol, etched on bone or stone, could carry power, for luck, for healing, for protection. Stories tell of warriors marking their blades with runes before battle, or women binding their lovers with charms to keep them safe. Though there were priests, Godar in Iceland for instance, religion was often personal. Headmen led sacrifices. Families passed on prayers and rituals. Belief was not imposed. It was woven into the patterns of life, in naming children, in burying the dead, in the first drink of a shared meal. The gods were not perfect. They lied, cheated, failed. But this made them more real, not less. They understood hardship because they faced it themselves. Even the gods were doomed. Ragnarok, the end of the world, would one day come. The signs would be clear. A long winter, a sky darkened by wolves, a ship made of dead men's nails sailing to war. Odin would fall to Fenrir. Thor would slay the serpent Jörmungandr, only to take 9 steps and die from its venom. The world would burn, sink, and then be reborn. This story was not told to inspire fear. It was told to prepare, to live well, knowing that nothing lasts forever was a virtue. Honor was found not in survival, but in meeting fate with courage. That was the Norse way. Even as Vikings settled in new lands, their beliefs followed them. In Dublin, in York, in the Danelaw, they brought their gods. But slowly, they began to change. In places where Christianity was strong, conversion was often encouraged, or required, to trade, to marry, to rule. Some Viking leaders, like Guthrum, accepted baptism. It was a practical decision, not always a spiritual one. But the change did not come overnight. In many regions, Norse pagans and Christians lived side by side. Churches were built, crosses were raised, yet grave goods continued to include swords and beads, as if covering both hopes, salvation and memory. Some crosses, like the famous Gosford cross in Cumbria, show carvings that blend Christian and Norse imagery. Thor and Christ, carved into the same stone. 2 stories, side by side. In time, belief softened. The edges of old faiths wore smooth. People still told tales of Odin and Thor, even as they knelt at Christian altars. These stories did not vanish. They lived on, in sagas, in runestones, in lullabies, and perhaps most of all, in the way people faced the unknown. Because the Norse legacy was not just in ships and battles. It was in the quiet certainty that life is short, that fate is strong, and that how one meets the end, with a laugh, a prayer, or a raised blade, is the truest measure of the soul. And so they remembered. When the fjords of Norway grew crowded, when kings gathered too much power, and when disputes could no longer be settled with words alone, some Norse families looked not to their neighbours, but to the sea. West of the known world, beyond the edges of familiar coastlines, lay places of rumour, possibility, and silence. These were not lands of conquest, but of exile, escape, and hope. And so began one of the most remarkable chapters of the Viking story. Not a tale of burning monasteries or clashing swords, but of long voyages, survival on the margins, and the building of new homes far from old roots. In the late 800s, King Harald Fairhair began to consolidate Norway. According to saga tradition, he vowed not to cut his hair until he had unified the land. Whether or not this oath was real, what followed was a steady process of centralization. Local jarls and free farmers, once independent and loosely governed, now faced the growing reach of royal power. Some resisted, others fled, and among those who departed were a group of men and women who set their sails westward, following whispers of a large island glimpsed across the sea. That island was Iceland. It wasn't entirely unknown. Irish monks had reportedly visited it in earlier centuries, seeking solitude, but they left little trace. When Norse explorers arrived in the second half of the 9th century, they found a land of stark beauty, broad lava fields, ice-capped volcanoes, green valleys framed by stone cliffs. There were no forests to speak of. The weather was cold, the soil thin, but there was pasture, clean water, fish, and space. Endless space. The first settlers came in small groups. Some were exiles, banished from Norway. Others came voluntarily, bringing families, livestock, and timber. The ships were packed tight with the elements of a new life. They landed along the coasts, carving out turf houses, fencing land, and naming every hill, stream, and bay. By 930, most of the arable land in Iceland had been claimed. But Iceland was not just a settlement. It became a society. One of its most remarkable features was the Althing, established around 930. This National Assembly was one of the oldest parliaments in the world. Every summer, chieftains, farmers, and law speakers gathered at Thingvellir, a great plain surrounded by rocky cliffs and lava fields. There, under the open sky, laws were recited from memory, disputes resolved, marriages arranged, and judgments declared. There were no kings in Iceland, no castles or standing armies. Authority came from consensus, from wealth, from honor. Blood feuds still occurred. Violence was not unknown. But the Althing offered a framework, imperfect, evolving, but deeply rooted. It was a society where law walked beside the axe, and memory held the weight of government. Life in Iceland was not easy. Winters were long and dark. The growing season was short. Sheep and cattle had to be sheltered and fed through snowstorms. Firewood was scarce, and much of the heat came from turf insulation and shared body warmth. People lived in close quarters, with smoky hearths and low ceilings. Yet the people adapted. They fished, raised animals, collected driftwood, and built tightly knit communities, and they told stories. From this land of rock and silence came the sagas, oral histories passed down through generations, later written in ink on calfskin. These were not just myths. They told of real men and women, of feuds and voyages, of law and loss. Iceland became a keeper of memory, a library of the North, even as it stood alone in the sea. But Iceland, too, was not the end. From its western shores, new journeys began. One of the most famous belonged to a man named Eric the Red. Born in Norway, exiled to Iceland for murder, Eric again found himself outlawed and again turned his eyes west. In the 980s, he sailed toward a land spoken of in rumour, a place of icebergs and rock glimpsed by earlier sailors driven off course. He found it, a land massive, cold, and rimmed with glaciers. He called it Greenland. It was a clever name, perhaps hopeful, perhaps a lure for future settlers. The southern coasts of Greenland did have green slopes in summer and enough pasture for sheep and goats. Eric returned to Iceland with his story and gathered followers. In 985, a fleet of 25 ships left for Greenland. Only 14 made it. The rest were lost at sea. Still, the settlement took root. Two main colonies formed, the eastern settlement near present-day Qaqortoq and the western settlement farther north. They were not large, perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 people at their height, but they built farms, churches, and assembly places. They raised livestock, hunted seals, and carved out a fragile existence on the edge of the known world. Greenland's Norse society was deeply Christian. Churches were built early. Graves show careful placement and ritual, yet the old ways echoed. Runic inscriptions survived. The rhythm of the sea still shaped life. And beyond the ice was always the question, what lies farther west? That question was answered by Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red. Sometime around the year 1000, Leif sailed even farther, following a tale told by Bjarni Herjolfsson, a merchant who had sighted wooded lands west of Greenland, but never landed. Leif set out with a small crew and found a land of beaches, forests, wild grapes and rivers. He named it Vinland. The exact location of Vinland is still debated, but archaeological evidence suggests that Norse explorers reached the northern tip of Newfoundland in modern Canada. At Lens aux Meadows, remains of Norse-style buildings, ironworking and artifacts have been uncovered, proving that the Norse were the first Europeans to set foot in the Americas 5 centuries before Columbus. But the settlement was short-lived. Challenges abounded. Harsh winters, long supply routes, and, most importantly, conflict with the indigenous peoples, likely ancestors of the Beothuk or other native groups. The Norse called them Skraelings, a vague term meaning something like wretches or outsiders. There was trade, there was tension, and according to the sagas, there was violence. The Norse were not equipped for sustained conflict so far from home. After a few years, the outpost was abandoned. Vinland faded into legend. Greenland persisted for a few more centuries, but as the climate cooled during the Little Ice Age and trade routes shifted, it too declined. By the 1400s, the Norse colonies in Greenland vanished. The last written records are of a wedding, a church payment, and then silence. But what remains is the spirit of those journeys. To sail west into the fog with no promise of land was not an act of aggression. It was an act of faith, a belief in survival, in discovery, in the human urge to push outward. The Norse who settled Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland were not kings or raiders. They were families, farmers, outlaws, and dreamers. They packed their lives into boats and built new worlds from wind and wood. They brought their gods, their laws, their sagas. They shaped new landscapes with old hands. And though many of their colonies would not last, the mark they left was deeper than stone. It was a mark of courage, of endurance, of looking beyond the familiar and calling a cold, quiet place home. By the dawn of the 10th century, the world the Vikings had once startled was beginning to change. Across Europe, kings were growing stronger, borders more defined. Monasteries that once lay exposed behind wooden fences now stood behind stone walls. The age of endless raiding was slowing, not because the Norse had vanished, but because they were becoming something new. For over a century, Norse fleets had troubled the rivers of Francia, the kingdom that would one day become France. The Seine, the Loire, the Garonne, all had seen longships slip inland like shadows, raiding towns, burning abbeys, and demanding tribute. But by the early 900s, a new kind of confrontation was taking place. Not one of battle, but of settlement, diplomacy, and transformation. At the heart of this change was a man named Rollo. Rollo was a Norse leader, perhaps Danish, perhaps Norwegian, who had raided deep into Frankish lands. In 911, he led a force that besieged the city of Chartres. It was not his first campaign in the region. By then, Rollo and his men had wintered along the Seine, establishing semi-permanent bases, extracting tribute, and slowly becoming part of the landscape. But now, the Frankish king, Charles the Simple, offered Rollo something different: land in exchange for loyalty. The offer was strategic. Rather than fight off the Norse again and again, Charles would give them land, on the condition they defend the kingdom from future Viking attacks. It was, in a way, hiring the fox to guard the henhouse. But it worked. Rollo accepted the deal. He was granted land around the mouth of the Seine, territory that would come to be known as Normandy, or Land of the Northmen. He pledged loyalty to the Frankish king and converted to Christianity, being baptized with the name Robert. He married a Frankish noblewoman, adopted local customs, and settled his followers in the new duchy. But Rollo did not forget where he came from. His court blended Norse and Frankish traditions. Norse names persisted for generations. The Norse language, Old Norse, gradually gave way to Old French, but not before shaping the dialect that would become Norman French. The settlers farmed, traded, and built towns, becoming not Norse raiders, but Norman nobles. This transformation was not unique to Normandy. Across the British Isles, similar processes were underway. In the Danelaw, Norse settlers intermarried with Anglo-Saxons, adopted Christianity, and participated in the local economy. In Dublin, Norse Gaels emerged, a cultural blend of Norse and Irish identity. In Orkney and Shetland, Norse rule persisted, but grew less violent, more administrative. Christianization played a central role in these changes. The Norse had once been feared for their attacks on monasteries, but by the 10th century, Viking leaders were building churches of their own. In Denmark, King Harald Bluetooth, the same man whose name was given to modern Bluetooth technology, officially converted to Christianity around 965. A massive stone, the Jelling Stone, still stands as a monument to this moment. Its runic inscription declares Harald as the king who won all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. The transition was not instant. Pagan traditions remained strong in rural areas. Old rituals continued quietly, sometimes side by side with new Christian practices. Burial customs evolved slowly. Graves that once held weapons and charms began to hold crosses and rosaries. Churches were built, bishops appointed, and literacy spread. Norway followed a rockier path. Conversion was driven more by political force than gentle persuasion. King Olaf Tryggvason, who reigned from 995 to 1000, used both missionary work and intimidation. Idols were torn down, temples burned, and dissenters punished. Later kings, including Saint Olaf, continued this policy. In time, Norway became Christian, though echoes of the old gods persisted in place names and folklore. Sweden was slower to convert. Its geography made it harder to unify, and its ties to the pagan East, through trade with the Baltic and Russia, reinforced older beliefs. But even there, by the mid-11th century, Christianity had taken root. In Greenland, the Norse colonies embraced Christianity early. A bishopric was established in Gardar, and churches dotted the icy landscape. In 1408, a wedding was recorded there, the last written record of Norse Greenlanders. Their faith had outlived their colony. As the Norse peoples converted, so too did their identity. No longer raiders from a distant coast, they became Europeans, dukes, kings, and merchants. Their children grew up speaking Latin in schools. Their warriors rode horses, bore coats of arms, and served in court. But the legacy of their past remained, etched into language, law, and memory. Perhaps nowhere was this legacy more dramatically realized than in 1066. By that year, the age of Viking raids had ended. The longships still sailed, but as trading vessels, not war machines. Viking kings ruled settled lands, Denmark, Norway, parts of Britain. Yet the ripples of their past still moved across Europe. In England, the death of Edward the Confessor triggered a succession crisis. Competing claims emerged. One came from Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, a descendant of Viking nobility. He believed he had a right to the English throne, based on earlier promises and alliances. Another claimant was William, Duke of Normandy, a descendant of Rollo, born of a Norse line but raised in the world of Frankish knights and Norman courts. In September of 1066, Harald Hardrada invaded England, landing in the north with a fleet and army. He was met by King Harold Godwinson, the newly crowned English king. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harold was defeated and killed, a dramatic end to the era of Viking invasions. His was the last great Viking campaign, but the story didn't end there. Barely 3 weeks later, William of Normandy invaded from the south. On October 14th, 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, William's Norman forces defeated Harold's army. Harold was killed, and William claimed the throne of England. He became William the Conqueror, and from that moment on, the kings of England would trace their lineage not only to Saxon ancestors, but to Vikings. The conquest brought immense change. Castles, feudalism, a new ruling class. But it also represented a full circle. In the year 793, Norse raiders had first struck Lindisfarne, shaking the Christian world. Now, nearly 3 centuries later, their descendants ruled the very land they had once ravaged. Yet even as the age of conquest faded, the Viking world did not disappear. In rural Scandinavia, old customs lingered. In the far north, Sami traditions, Norse rituals, and Christian beliefs blended into something unique. In Iceland, the sagas were still told, of Egil Skallagrimsson, of Grettir the Strong, of Njal and the Burning. These were stories not of gods, but of people, flawed, proud, brave. The memory of the Viking Age was not just in battles, but in voices passed from hearth to hearth. And in the stones, the stories endured. Rune stones carved in Old Norse still stand across Sweden and Denmark. Some boast of voyages, others mark graves. One reads, he died in the east among the Circlan people. Another, he took part in the raid when the men burned Hedeby. Each is a whisper from the past, silent but not forgotten. So what ended the Viking Age? There was no single moment, no final ship to slip beneath the waves. It was a transformation, not an ending. A world of raiders became a world of rulers. Sailors became settlers. Kings replaced chieftains. And the memory of the longship, of the cold wind and the wooden longhouse became legend. By 1066, the Norse had given Europe more than fear. They had shaped its languages, its cities, its ruling houses. They had mapped its seas, carved stories into stone, and carried echoes of their gods into the folds of new faiths. And though the sails faded from the horizon, their stories sailed on, away from the roar of longships and the thunder of war. Most Viking lives unfolded in quiet places, in smoke-filled longhouses, in damp fields scraped by hand, and in the murmuring rhythm of markets by the fjord's edge. While some men sailed far in search of silver or fame, the great majority stayed close to the soil. Their victories were not marked by banners or blood, but by warm winters, healthy livestock, and full grain stores. If we are to understand the Viking Age, we must not only sail with kings, we must also sit beside the hearth and watch the day begin. The heart of Viking life was the longhouse. Built of timber or turf depending on the region, it was long and narrow, with walls that leaned slightly inward. Roofs were steep, thatched with grass or wooden shingles, designed to shed the snow and rain. Inside, a single large room stretched the length of the house. Along its sides were wooden platforms, used for sitting during the day and sleeping at night. In the center, a fire pit burned low, its smoke curling up through a hole in the roof. Light filtered in dimly through small slits or open doorways. Life in the longhouse was communal. Families lived together, grandparents, parents, children, and sometimes servants or freedmen. In wealthier homes, enslaved people may have also shared the space. Privacy was limited. Warmth was shared. In winter, animals might be brought inside, huddled at one end of the house, their breath mingling with the humans. The smells of wool, smoke, leather, stew, and sweat wove together into a constant background. There were no clocks, no artificial lights, only the turning of the seasons and the sun's slow arc. Each day began with work. In spring and summer, the men took to the fields. Farming was the backbone of the Norse economy. The land was cleared by hand, with iron-tipped ploughs pulled by oxen. In southern Scandinavia, barley, rye, oats, and wheat were grown in rotation. Farther north or west, where the soil was poorer, hay was cut for winter fodder, and hardy vegetables like cabbage, onions, and beans were tended. Harvest time brought long days, with entire families working in rhythm to gather crops before the weather turned. Animal husbandry was equally essential. Sheep provided wool and meat. Goats, hardy and nimble, gave milk and could survive on rocky hills. Cattle were prized, not just for food, but for status. To own many cattle was to command respect. Pigs foraged freely, fed on scraps and the forest nuts. Horses were used for riding, especially by the upper class, and occasionally pulled carts. Chickens clucked freely around the yard. Each creature had its place. Women ran the household. They churned butter, spun wool, wove cloth, brewed ale, baked flatbread, and managed stores. Their work was constant but respected. In Norse law and custom, women had notable rights. They could own land, inherit property, initiate divorce, and run farms in their husband's absence. A silver brooch at a woman's shoulder marked not only status, but authority. It held her dress and her domain in place. Children were folded into work early. Boys herded animals, fetched water, helped in the fields. Girls learned spinning, weaving, and food preparation. Play still found its way in, wooden toys, carved animals, and ball games. But childhood was brief. By 12 or 13, a child was expected to carry real responsibility. Life was demanding, and every hand mattered. Meals were simple. In the morning, cold porridge or bread. Midday, a stew of meat or fish with root vegetables. In the evening, more bread, maybe dried fruit or cheese. Utensils were basic. Wooden bowls, iron knives and hands. Ale and buttermilk were common drinks. Mead was reserved for feasts. Salted herring, smoked lamb, or dried cod sustained many through the winter. Spices were rare, but herbs, dill, thyme, angelica, added flavour. Salt was precious, often harvested from evaporated seawater. The hearth was not only for cooking, it was a sacred space, the centre of warmth, stories and remembrance. Here old legends were told, of gods and giants, of ancestors long dead. Runes might be carved into the beams above. Family histories were passed by mouth. No ink or parchment, just memory and voice. The fire flickered, casting shadows against the wooden walls, and the long night passed in quiet thought. Beyond the farm, life pulsed in marketplaces. Though the Norse were self-sufficient, they relied on trade. Seasonal markets appeared near river crossings, on harbour shores, or beside important temples. People came from miles around, farmers, merchants, craftsmen and travellers. Boats full of goods were hauled up onto muddy banks. Tents and stalls were raised. There one might find iron tools, carved combs, linen cloth, dyed wool, soapstone bowls, amber beads, glass trinkets, and imported silks. Coins were rare at first. Trade worked through barter. 1 goat for 2 bundles of cloth, a set of fish hooks for a pot of honey. Over time, silver became the standard. Arm rings and hack silver, cut bits of silver used by weight, were used to seal deals. Merchants often carried small scales. Markets were also social. News was exchanged, songs sung, disputes aired, marriages arranged. In some places, laws were recited or announced. The market was where the isolated homestead touched the wider world. Here, a farmer might hear of a war far away, or see spices from the east. It was a place of wonder, even in its simplicity. Craftsmanship held great value. Viking tools, weapons and jewellery were carefully made. Blacksmiths forged not only blades, but ploughs, nails and hinges. Woodworkers carved bowls, furniture, and the curved ribs of ships. Weavers used looms weighted with stone to create complex patterns. Bone and antler were shaped into combs and game pieces. Leather was tanned, dyed, and stitched into shoes, belts, and bags. Homes displayed these works not for decoration alone, but as signs of diligence and pride. A well-carved spindle, a sturdy door hinge, a finely woven cloak. These were the marks of a good household. Beauty and function walked hand in hand. Time was marked by the seasons. Spring brought planting and new lambs. Summer was for haying and weddings. Autumn meant harvest and slaughter. Winter was the hardest. Snow drifted against the door. Daylight vanished early, and all waited for the return of the sun. But winter also brought feasting, storytelling, and closeness. The festival of Yule celebrated light in the dark, with evergreen branches, fires, and toasts to the gods and the ancestors. Illness and injury were constant concerns. There were no hospitals, but herbs and knowledge passed through families. Women served as healers, using poultices, teas and prayers. Cuts were cleaned with moss and honey. Fevers treated with yarrow or willow bark. Still, many children died young, and even simple wounds could prove fatal. To live was to endure, and to help others endure. Despite these hardships, life was not joyless. The Norse found delight in music, dance, games and poetry. Harps and flutes accompanied songs. Riddles and drinking contests lit up gatherings. Wrestling matches, dice games and board games like Nefataful filled quiet evenings. Carvings of gods and animals adorned doorposts. Painted shields brightened the walls. Pride was taken in clean homes, strong livestock, and well-kept tools. The social structure was layered but fluid. At the top were jarls, local lords with wealth and influence. Below them were carls, free farmers and craftsmen. At the bottom were thralls, enslaved people captured in raids or born into bondage. Some thralls could earn or be granted freedom. Most households, even modest ones, had someone in service, though conditions varied. Norse society valued independence, but it was not equal. Still, mobility was possible. A clever man could rise through trade. A brave woman might manage a farm or win influence. Honor was currency, and a well-run household brought respect. Oaths, hospitality and reputation carried weight. To break a promise was shameful. To stand by one's kin was essential. In the far north, beyond the settled lands, Sami communities lived differently, semi-nomadic, following reindeer herds, fishing, and practicing their own rituals. They traded with the Norse, shared knowledge of the land, and sometimes intermarried. Though often seen as outsiders, they too were part of this shared northern world. And so, as the sun set over the low hills and smoke rose from chimney holes, another Viking day came to rest. A child leaned against her mother, listening to a story. A farmer ran a hand along the edge of a newly forged blade. A pot bubbled over the hearth, filling the room with the smell of onions and broth. Outside, snow gathered on the roof. Inside, the fire glowed. Life was hard, but it was lived fully, day by day, season by season, hand in hand. The Norse world was never without gods. For as long as there were long nights and storm-dark seas, the people of the north had stories to make sense of them. They knew the feel of a sacred grove beneath snow-heavy branches. They whispered names into the wind: Odin, Freya, Thor. Not as myth, but as memory. The gods were not distant, they were close. They walked beside warriors and stirred in the roots of trees. But the world does not stay still, and neither did belief. In time, new symbols came. Not carved dragons or thunder hammers, but wooden crosses, stone churches, and prayers spoken in Latin. The conversion of the Norse to Christianity was not a single moment, not the flash of a sword or a king's command. It was a long, uneven process that unfolded over centuries, beginning with whispers on the wind, flickering through the smoke of burning temples, and finally settling into the quiet regularity of bells and psalms. Some accepted it eagerly, some resisted. Some kept both faiths alive inside them, quietly, for years. The first seeds of Christianity in Scandinavia were planted not by force, but by contact. From the 8th and 9th centuries onward, Norse traders, raiders, and settlers encountered Christian communities across the British Isles, Francia, and the Carolingian Empire. In these lands, they saw stone churches, cloisters, holy relics, and a faith centered not on feasting or fate, but on salvation and submission. At first, Christianity was strange, even unappealing. The Norse prized personal honor, reciprocal gift-giving, and proud independence. Christianity, with its demands for humility, peace, and one true God, seemed rigid. Pagan rituals were sensory, seasonal, and communal. Offerings to the land, to ancestors, to gods who asked for sacrifice but offered strength in return. The Christian God was invisible, unknowable, his priests speaking in a language few understood. Yet with familiarity came adaptation. Some Norse converted while abroad, often for political reasons. Accepting baptism could help secure trade, alliances, or peace. A Norse chieftain might be baptized in a Frankish court, then return home and continue honoring Thor. Others converted when marrying Christian spouses or settling in Christian lands. But real, widespread change came only when kings made it their mission. In Denmark, the turning point came in the late 10th century under King Harald Bluetooth Gormson. According to the runestone he raised at Jelling, Harald won all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. The truth is more complex. Harald's conversion may have come under pressure from the Holy Roman Empire or through the influence of his Christian wife Tove. But his reign marked a clear pivot. Churches were built, clergy were welcomed, pagan temples began to close. Still, resistance ran deep. In Denmark, as elsewhere, Christianity didn't replace the old ways overnight. It layered over them. Wooden idols might be hidden beneath church floors. Sacred springs continued to be visited. Even runestones sometimes bore both Christian crosses and pagan symbolism. It was not betrayal, but blending, a gradual shifting of world view. In Norway, the process was more turbulent. The first Christian missionaries arrived as early as the 9th century, but with little impact. It was Olaf Tryggvason, who ruled from 995 to 1000, who launched a more forceful campaign. A fiery and zealous convert, Olaf traveled the countryside destroying idols, building churches, and threatening death or exile to those who refused baptism. His methods were aggressive. He was said to have drowned, blinded, or maimed pagan priests, and his reign, though brief, left a mark. After Olaf Tryggvason's death, the work was taken up by Olaf Haraldsson, later known as Saint Olaf. His rule, beginning in 1015, also promoted Christianity, though with more enduring success. Olaf established bishoprics, codified Christian law, and encouraged monastic learning. After his death in battle in 1030, stories of miracles spread. His grave became a pilgrimage site. Canonized as a saint, Olaf became a symbol of Christian Norway. Even for those who had once feared or hated him, Sweden converted more slowly. Its decentralized power, rugged geography, and stronger ties to pagan centers in the east made Christian influence harder to enforce. The first Christian king, Olof Skotkonung, ruled around the year 1000. He was baptized, minted coins with Christian imagery, and built churches. But his own people clung to the old gods. In Uppsala, the great pagan temple still stood, said to be gilded in gold, its statues of Thor, Odin, and Freyr adorned with offerings of blood. Conversion here was piecemeal, resisted by powerful local chieftains. Only in the 12th century did Christianity become dominant. In Iceland, the transition was unique. The island settlers had brought their pagan beliefs with them, but by the late 10th century, pressure from Christian Europe was growing. Missionaries arrived. Some chieftains converted. Tensions rose between Christian and pagan factions. Civil war seemed possible. But in the year 1000, at the Althing, Iceland's National Assembly made a remarkable decision. the island would convert peacefully. The law speaker, Thorgeir Torkelson, himself a pagan, spent a day and night under a fur blanket in contemplation. Emerging the next morning, he declared that Iceland would accept Christianity, but allow quiet practice of pagan customs in private. The compromise worked. Temples faded, crosses rose, but tolerance, not violence, had made the change possible. In Greenland, conversion came quickly. The Norse settlers there were connected to Iceland and brought Christianity with them. A bishopric was established in Gardar, and churches were constructed from stone. Burial grounds show the shift clearly. Early graves contain Thor's hammers, while later ones bear crosses. The Christian community endured even as the colony declined. With the spread of Christianity came new customs. Burial practices changed first. In pagan times, cremation or ship burials were common. High-status individuals were interred with weapons, tools, food, and animals for the afterlife. Christian burials were simpler. Bodies laid east-west, hands folded, in consecrated ground. Over time, grave goods vanished, and churches were built near cemeteries to guide the souls of the dead. Church buildings transformed the landscape. At first, they were wooden, simple structures with sod roofs. Later, stone churches rose, their towers visible for miles. They became centers not only of worship, but of law, literacy, and community. Monks copied manuscripts. Priests recorded births and marriages. The church calendar reshaped time itself. Yule became Christmas. Spring rites merged with Easter, and saints' days punctuated the year. The clergy brought new authority. Bishops and priests introduced Christian law, oversaw moral behavior, and replaced the oral traditions of the law speaker with written codes. Some villages resented their influence. Others welcomed the order. Over time, tithes, fasting, confession, and penance became part of daily life. Still, the old beliefs did not vanish. They lingered in folklore, in proverbs, in the names of the days. Thursday still bore Thor's name. Midsummer fires burned in honor of light and fertility. Farmers whispered thanks to the land spirits. In some rural areas, charms were used alongside Christian prayers. The two faiths wove together like threads in a tapestry, overlapping, fading, but never fully erased. Women played a quiet role in the spread of Christianity. As guardians of the hearth, they preserved and adapted domestic rituals. Many Christian converts came through marriage. Christian queens and noblewomen sponsored churches, funded missionaries, and raised their children in the new faith. While the formal clergy remained male, women shaped the faith at home, in lullabies, in mealtime blessings, in funeral rites. The saga literature of Iceland, written in the Christian era, often reflected this blend. Though composed by Christian scribes, they preserved pagan heroes, mythic battles, and ancient values. Odin and Christ appeared on the same pages, sometimes side by side. The result was not confusion, but continuity, a bridge between old and new. So how did it feel to live through this great change? For some, it meant safety. Christian Europe now welcomed Norse traders, settlers, and rulers. For others, it meant loss, the slow erasure of ancestral rites, the silencing of familiar gods. But for most, it was not so dramatic. Life continued. Bread was baked. Animals tended. The sun still rose over snow-covered fields. The gods had changed, but the earth had not. And so, the Norse became Christian. Not overnight, not all at once, but through patience, politics, fear, and faith. By the end of the 11th century, the cross stood where the hammer once had. Bells rang where horns had called, and prayers rose not to Odin on his throne, but to a crucified god whose kingdom lay in heaven. Yet even now, when the wind blows across an old burial mound, or when a name like Thorstein or Freyr echoes in the hills, the memory of the old world stirs. The Norse did not forget their gods. They simply folded them into the soil, like ash into snow, like roots into stone. By the year 1000, the winds that once carried longships into foreign harbours began to calm. The sea still whispered of voyages and storms, but the age of sudden raids and fire-touched monasteries was fading. The world was changing, and so too were the Norse. Kings now ruled where chieftains once reigned. Priests spoke Latin from pulpits. Laws were written, not sung. And while the hammer of Thor still adorned pendants in quiet valleys, it did so beside the cross. This was the twilight of the Viking Age, a time of transition, a moment when what was wild became structured, and what had once terrified the continent quietly joined it. In Denmark, the transformation was clearest. The unification that had begun under Harald Bluetooth continued. His descendants strengthened royal authority, established coinage, built churches, and invited bishops to administer dioceses. The Danish monarchy became more centralized. King Sigurd the Great, a generation later, would not only rule Denmark, but also England and Norway, forming what historians call the North Sea Empire. Though Canute was born of Viking stock, he ruled like a European monarch, issuing laws, minting coins, and marrying into Christian royalty. His court was filled not with warriors alone, but scribes, advisors, and priests. In Norway, similar changes unfolded. King Olaf Haraldsson, later canonized as Saint Olaf, helped enforce Christianity and build a national identity. Though his reign ended in battle, his memory unified the country. Pilgrims visited his shrine at Nidaros. Kings ruled with greater authority. Towns like Bergen and Trondheim grew as centers of trade and governance. The loosely knit patchwork of fjord communities slowly became a kingdom. Sweden, more dispersed and forested, moved more gradually. Pagan holdouts remained in the interior long after Denmark and Norway had turned to Christianity. But even here, the shift was steady. The temple at Uppsala, once a shining symbol of the old gods, was replaced by a church. Kings aligned with the church to secure power. Coins bearing Christian imagery replaced barter and hacksilver. Cities like Sigtuna and Visby on Gotland grew as vital links in the Baltic trade. These monarchs were no longer just warlords. They became administrators. They issued written laws preserved in runes and then in Latin. Councils and courts began to replace clan vengeance. The power of the thing, the traditional assembly, was tempered by royal authority and Christian morality. Disputes once settled with blades were now judged with oaths and testimony. The age of the Viking raid gave way to the age of the castle. Across Europe, stone fortresses rose. Armoured knights replaced berserkers. Siege engines outpaced shield walls. The Norse, once feared for their mobility and daring, now adapted to this new world. They built their own fortifications, adopted cavalry tactics, and trained in the art of diplomacy. Trade, too, transformed. The Norse were always traders as much as warriors. In this new age, their networks grew more formal. The Baltic Sea became a highway of commerce, linking Scandinavia to the German cities of the Hanseatic League, to Novgorod in the east, and to England and Flanders in the west. Wool, fish, timber, iron and furs flowed out. Silver, spices, cloth and wine flowed in. Towns expanded. What were once seasonal marketplaces became permanent settlements. Craftsmen clustered in city quarters, blacksmiths, coopers, weavers and tanners. Churches rose beside harbours. Merchants' guilds formed. Literacy, once rare, spread through clerical schools. Monasteries preserved sagas and laws. The Norse world had not vanished. It had matured. Even the language began to shift. Old Norse evolved into early forms of Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, Icelandic, and Faroes. Latin began to appear in legal records and chronicles. New names, saints' days, and Christian phrases entered common speech. Yet echoes of the old tongue lingered, especially in Iceland, where the sagas would soon be written down. The sagas are among the clearest windows into this twilight world. Though composed in the 13th century, they remember events from the 9th to 11th centuries. They speak of feuds and voyages, family honour and quiet sorrow. They tell of men and women whose lives were shaped not just by fate, but by choice, loyalty and love. Though penned by Christian scribes, the sagas preserve the rhythms of an earlier time. In one, a young man sails west with little but a sword and a dream. In another, a woman stands alone before a council of men, defending her right to inherit. In a third, an aging warrior remembers a time when the gods still walked the earth. These are not stories of conquest, but of humanity. As the Norse settled into kingdoms, they began to look outward again, not to raid, but to join. One of the clearest examples is their participation in the Crusades. In 1196, Pope Urban II called for Christian knights to reclaim the Holy Land. Norsemen answered. Warriors from Denmark, Norway and Sweden joined the first and later Crusades. Some travelled to Constantinople, where they joined the Varangian Guard, the elite force sworn to protect the Byzantine Emperor. Their axe-wielding presence was feared and admired. Yet even this warrior role had changed. The Norse were now Christian warriors, fighting under the cross, not the raven banner. Their enemies were not monasteries, but Saracens. Their stories were not sung in mead halls, but written in crusade chronicles. At home, the Norse lands grew more tied to continental Europe. Marriages linked royal houses to those of Germany, France and England. Pilgrimages were made to Rome, to Santiago de Compostela and to Canterbury. The Norse were no longer outsiders, they were part of Christendom. Still, the memory of the Viking Age lingered. In Iceland, it lived on in verse and tale. In Denmark, in the raised runestones of Jelling. In Sweden, in the burial mounds that dotted the countryside. Even as new buildings rose, the past remained visible. So what, then, was lost? In this twilight, some things faded. The intimate connection to land and sea, once central to Norse belief, grew abstract. The communal rituals of blots and seasonal feasts were replaced by structured liturgy. The freedom of the thing was softened by hierarchy. The sound of the skald's voice in the smoky hall gave way to written law and official proclamation. But much remained. The Norse brought their resilience, their craftsmanship, their deep sense of honor into the new era. The stone churches they built were plain but solid. Their laws remained rooted in fairness. Their culture, though altered, was not erased, and in time, the Viking became legend. To their descendants, the word no longer meant pirate or raider. It meant courage, adventure, ancestry. The longships became symbols of pride. The old gods, once feared or revered, returned as stories for children. The sagas, written on calfskin and passed from hand to hand, kept the past alive. In the darkness of a long northern night beside the hearth, families still listened to tales of Ragnar and his sons, of Leif and his voyages, of Odin, one-eyed and wandering. The stories had changed, but the need for them had not. By 1200, the Viking Age was over. No more raids, no more sudden sails on the horizon. The Norse had become kings, bishops, farmers, merchants. They had built towns and carved laws. They had traded blades for pens, blood feuds for treaties. They had laid their past to rest, but gently. In their quiet twilight, they became what all peoples become, part of the great, slow turning of history. And yet, in the stillness of the fjords, or in the wildness of the Icelandic wind, the old world still lingers. You can feel it in the stones, hear it in the names, see it in the curve of a carved prow, dry-docked and weathered with age. The twilight of the Viking Age was not an ending, but an afterglow. A long, quiet breath before the stories were written down. And in that breath, something timeless remained. When the Viking Age came to an end, it did not vanish. Its sails may have disappeared from the sea, and its gods may have faded from living prayer, but the age itself settled quietly into the land, into the shape of a hill where a hall once stood, into the curve of a fjord remembered in a name, into the standing stones that marked forgotten graves. The Vikings were gone, but their echo remained, soft, enduring, and waiting to be heard again. For many centuries, this echo lived in Iceland, where the old stories were written down. Unlike other parts of Europe, Iceland had no native nobility to suppress oral tradition, and its isolation preserved a continuity of culture. In the 13th century, scribes working in monasteries and at farmsteads began to transcribe the sagas, long, detailed narratives of real and mythic events from earlier centuries. These included tales of blood feuds, voyages, kings, settlers, and gods. The Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson and the Poetic Edda, a compilation of older verse, captured the mythic core of the Norse world. These manuscripts became the guardians of memory. Without them, the names of Odin and Thor might have drifted into obscurity. Without them, we might not know of Vinland, of the All-Thing, of the strange dreamlike boundaries between fate and free will that shaped the Norse view of life. These books, copied by hand and passed through generations, became a quiet bridge between eras, a voice from the longhouse carried into the future by ink and vellum. In mainland Scandinavia, however, the Viking past was gradually buried beneath layers of time. Fields were ploughed where settlements had stood. Temples were replaced with churches. Over time, memory gave way to folklore. Stories of trolls in the mountains, of hidden people in the hills, of old gods turned into giants or forest spirits, all survived in fragmented form. Thor became a thunderous figure glimpsed in storms. Odin, a one-eyed wanderer whose name lived on in Wednesday. But few remembered their place in the living religion. Some runestones still stood, tall, narrow slabs carved with names, prayers, and dedications. Many marked the graves of those who had died in raids or travel abroad. Others were statements of power or memory. X raised this stone in memory of Y, who died in the east, or who gave his life for the king. For centuries, these stones were seen as curiosities. Locals might refer to them as devil's writing or magical marks. Some were built into church walls or used as foundation stones, hidden in plain sight. Graves and burial mounds remained as well, dotting the countryside. Many were never disturbed, but some were plundered long ago. In places like Uppsala, the great mounds were remembered in legend. In Norway and Denmark, low hills in the landscape hinted at older worlds beneath. The stones and mounds did not speak, but they waited. In time, a slow reawakening began. In the 1600s and 1700s, as Europe entered the Age of Enlightenment, scholars across the continent began to study ancient texts and ruins. Antiquarians in Sweden and Denmark turned their attention to the old runes. The first serious efforts to catalogue runestones began. Manuscripts in Iceland were preserved by devoted hands and sent to royal libraries in Copenhagen. Still, the Viking Age was misunderstood. To many, these ancestors were simply barbarians, violent, lawless pirates who disrupted the order of Christian Europe. Church historians had painted them this way in their chronicles: enemies of God, destroyers of monasteries, heathens with no culture or refinement. These views dominated for centuries, but slowly, new interpretations emerged. Travelers visited Iceland and marveled at the sagas. Scandinavian intellectuals began to see the Viking past not as a stain, but as a source of identity. The Norse were recast as noble, brave, adventurous, people who honored family, upheld law, and explored the edges of the world. This reimagining would grow in the centuries ahead. In the 19th century, this transformation accelerated. Across Europe, nationalism was rising. Countries looked to their pasts for stories of greatness. In Scandinavia, the Viking Age offered a ready-made heritage. Artists painted romantic scenes of longships and gods. Poets and playwrights revived sagas for the stage. Statues were raised. Viking imagery, once feared, became celebrated. At the same time, a new discipline was taking shape: archaeology. In 1868, the Gjörmundur helmet, the only complete Viking helmet ever found, was unearthed in Norway. In 1880, the tune ship was discovered. But the most famous find came in 1904, just beyond the boundary of our time frame, when the Oseberg ship, a beautifully preserved burial vessel, was found in a burial mound in Norway. It contained 2 women, richly buried with tapestries, carts, carved sleighs, and animals. The ship itself was a masterpiece of design. These discoveries changed everything. The Vikings were no longer shadows. They were real, tangible, creative. Their craftsmanship was exquisite. Their ships were engineering marvels. Their burial customs, complex and emotional. And the people, men and women alike, were sophisticated, spiritual, and deeply connected to their world. Back in Iceland, efforts to preserve the sagas grew stronger. Scholars began translating them into European languages. Historians re-evaluated their content, recognizing them as vital sources for understanding not just the Viking Age, but the emotional lives of those who lived it. These were not just adventure tales. They were about grief, pride, loss, and longing. Even as the modern world moved on, with railways, telegraphs, and global empires, the Viking Age remained a point of fascination. Children read about Eric the Red and Leif the Lucky. Scholars debated the location of Vinland. Museums displayed swords, brooches, and drinking horns. Folk festivals revived old costumes and dances. But beyond the celebration and spectacle, something deeper was happening: a reconnection. Villages that had once forgotten their past began to remember. Place names were studied, oral traditions revisited. The mounds and the fields were no longer seen as nuisances, but as sacred links to ancestors. The Viking Age was not just an episode of history, it was a cultural route. This rediscovery extended beyond Scandinavia. In Britain, traces of the Danelaw emerged in regional dialects, town names, and customs. In Russia, the Varangian legacy was studied anew. In Normandy, the memory of Rollo and his Norse settlers became part of regional identity. Even in North America, whispers of Vinland stirred imagination. Supported in the 20th century by the discovery of Lanceau Meadows, a Viking settlement site in Newfoundland. What makes this legacy so enduring? Perhaps it is the duality of the Viking world. They were raiders and traders, warriors and poets, builders of ships and tellers of sagas. They honored the gods and then quietly welcomed Christ. They vanished and yet remained. The long silence from 1200 to 1900 was not a forgetting, but a waiting. The land remembered, the stones remembered, the story slept, but they did not die. And when they were awakened by scholars, dreamers, farmers, and children, they returned not as ghosts, but as part of the living world. The Viking Age may have ended with the turning of a millennium, but its spirit sailed on, carried not just in bloodlines, but in language, in law, in art, and in the gentle way a people look back on who they were and recognize themselves.